to get our structure approved. And I had to attend a couple of those meetings in Addis to first negotiate. We started negotiating from the proposed structure. We had over 100 and something staff that we wanted. They kept pushing it down, cutting it back until we arrived at about 74 positions that they approved in the end. With that approval, we had hoped that the implementation would be very straightforward, that we will look at our own existing staff, because in fact, the final approved structure contained the position of every existing staff in this parliament. And we also made sure that all those existing staff, their positions were guaranteed under the new approved structure, and also the vacancies and key areas in which we didn't have staff were also included. Then we went for the summit. And then the final approval that came with conditions and methodologies for implementation. And that's where our problems started. They insisted in those conditions and methodologies. Remember last list for all those who are holding any position, that will be automatic for them to be shortlisted for those positions for the process. Now, we also made a provision for internal applications from members of staff who want to apply for positions within the system. And we're convinced that if you bring somebody to compete with me today for the presidency of the Pan-African Parliament and want us to go for an interview, he's from outside, he hasn't been here. If he beats me, then I should go home. I believe that I have learned the job long enough, I've been here long enough to be able to give a good account of myself if I have to compete with anybody. We're convinced that we will do whatever we can to support the process to make it as painless as possible. But the difficulties are that if you want to do a transparent process, there will be one or two, there are people who are holding certain positions who do not even have the required academic qualification required for that position by the African Union standards. I didn't make those standards. We're working on documents belonging to the African Union. So how do you deal with that kind of situation if you want to be transparent and open? Of course, there are also regulations about distribution, geographical balance. We're all here from all over Africa. And it's an African institution. So we must have staff from all over Africa. There's no reason why one state or region should have much more than others. So that is part of what we'll be asked to do, and we don't think there's anything wrong with it. There must be that balance and spread to ensure that every African nation has an opportunity to bring its citizens to work in our parliament and contribute his own quota. So those are issues that we are dealing with, but I want to promise you, honorable colleagues, that we are convinced that we must remain transparent, we must be fair, we must be just to all concerned, and we must be above board in our decision-making processes. And so the report, so far, we've looked at the 5, because of financial constraints, we are looking at the top 5 positions, which they have now started processing. The report should be available for us this week to begin the process of interviewing for those positions. And I've already stated it before, because we are a political institution, I'm going to invite not just the AUC and other relevant bodies to be part of the panel, but the chairs of all the 5 regional caucuses will join the Bureau to take those decisions collectively on your behalf. And so when that process is finished, then we cannot take ownership of it together. We are now in the process of arranging for those interviews in November, and hopefully by December it should be finished. And the chair raised an issue. We, as a Bureau, cannot take a decision on something that is clear in our rules of procedure. It says that plenary must approve the clerk and deputy clerk. So plenary would have to, they will have to wait for the approval of the clerk and deputy clerk. There's nothing we can do about that. They'll have to wait for plenary to approve it. I would never, if with my 27 years as a lawyer, I can stand and watch the rules of our institution not be obeyed and be part of it, then there's something wrong in that kind of process. So we will bring it before the appropriate authority to take the appropriate decision, and we will move forward with it. Honorable colleagues, we also had this issue of the rest of the staff. We at the Bureau have continued to try to manage the process. Those whose interviews have not fallen into this immediate first 5 will, hopefully by next year, we'll get enough resources to fund it. We will continue, and we have agreed at the last Bureau meeting to further extend. An issue was raised about extension and employment. I think that if you read the rules properly, it says that we must approve the appointment. What we have done is an extension, and I think an extension is within the rights of the Bureau to extend an existing appointment. I cannot expect that each time we want to extend an appointment of somebody who has already been appointed by this Bureau and who has gone through the necessary staff assessment processes, we need to come back to labor the Bureau with a 6-month extension to an existing contract. I think we are still within the rules, because the rule says appointment and not necessarily extension of an existing appointment. We have looked at it, and we have extended all the staff whose positions have not been, whose positions may not be interviewed fully, to April, to give them enough time to participate in the process, so that by the time we come here in May, we would have, hopefully, if adequate funds are available, concluded this process. It is not our making, it's a painful process, but we have to deal with it, because that's where we have found ourselves. But I want to promise, like I've done all the time, that we will do it in full transparency, with clarity, and we are always available to explain to the individual members of Parliament whose constituents would have approached you. Please feel free to come to my office anytime. I've had the opportunity to discuss with many regional delegations on it. We will explain to you where we are and why we are where we are. And we look forward to your continued support and cooperation to ensure that this Parliament is endowed with the level of secretariat that we require. Honourable colleagues, another issue that has been raised by many who had spoken is the issue of the election observation missions. This is a very important role for our Parliament. Honourable members will recall that historically the Pan-African Parliament used to send independent election observation missions to member states. We had a budget line for election observation. But following one particular election observation mission, we issued a report that was different from the report of the Union. The politics of election observation came to the fore. And the Pan-African Parliament was now, by Executive Council decision, requested to be part and parcel of the African Union election observation missions. And that way, we were no longer allowed to hold our own independent election observation missions. How did they do it further? To reinforce it, the budget line for election observation by Pan-African Parliament was cancelled. So we didn't even have the resources to carry out the election observation missions, even if we wanted to. And of course, you know that the danger that we will stand if we took donor funds to go on election observation missions would mean that a lot of political misinterpretation will be put into it. So it's not an option available to us. Yes, we agree that the conditions that we have found ourselves in are bad. I've had opportunity to negotiate with the former Commissioner for Political Affairs, and we put on the table all our concerns, starting from the leadership of the election observation missions. Now we have agreed that we will have 40% of the delegation to be made up of Pan-African parliamentarians. That is being implemented, but the only problem with it is that we never have enough people from amongst our members ready and available to attend at every election observation mission, because sometimes they get the notice very late, sometimes they also have administrative problems managing their tickets and flights. So, but we've agreed in principle in our first negotiations that the 40% of that delegation will come from the parliament. We also demanded that the deputy leader, in fact, at first, my first demand was that the leadership should be alternated between the PAP and AU. So if one mission has a PAP member leading the mission, then the next one they can take somebody else from the AU. But they explained to us that, you know, election observation missions are not necessarily just looking at elections only. Sometimes they involve some peace-building efforts. Sometimes they involve some level of negotiations, and that they have decided that former heads of states were in a better position to midwife some of these processes, especially in a build-up to some of the elections in some troubled areas. I said, okay, that's fine. We respect our former heads of states. So long as it's former heads of state, we would work under them. We'll be happy to be part of this process. But we demand the deputy leader position. Create a deputy leader position for our delegation so that we can be part and parcel of the decision-making process. And they said they would look into it at our next meeting. So we had a list of demands about air tickets, travel, class of travel, because I said to them, MPs in my country, in the order of protocol, are over and above most of people here. And that same applies to most member states. And you cannot be giving us tickets on economic class, while some senior staff of the union would go on business class. So we had that argument back and forth, and they said, well, the rules. I said, well, your rules, your financial rules and regulations that we have seen and we have gone through have no provision for members of parliament. They were not considered in your rules and regulations, and they must amend those rules. In fact, the process is on now based on our insistence that the rules be amended, and there's a meeting to make our inputs on the new amendment to the financial rules, which we believe should capture the true status of members of parliament.
The occasion has provided us with a renewed purpose to focus on the energies of the future. Thus, the theme of Pan-Africanism and African Renaissance has been the clarion call for these celebrations of our 50th anniversary. However, we have to bear in mind that the vision embedded in the theme, the vision of our fathers who laid down their lives so that we could be free, the vision of an integrated, prosperous and peaceful Africa, driven by its own citizens and representing a dynamic force in the global arena. This vision cannot be achieved without unity of purpose. And you, as members of both our national and continental parliaments, respectively, have a singularly important role to play. Mr. President, that Africa is the next frontier of development is now a common theme. Africa provides huge market opportunities. It is fast becoming urbanized, with the number of people living in cities estimated to reach 50% by 2030, larger than India. 6 out of 10 fastest growing economies in the world are in sub-Saharan Africa, And over the past decade, about a third of 54 states have consistently seen about 6% growth rates in Africa. Africa is slowly but surely becoming more stable politically and economically. Most countries have adopted pragmatic economic policies. Our external debt over the last decade has reduced from over 60% in 1998 to just over 25% in 2007. This phenomenon was part of Africa's performance, which was better than most regions in the world in the wake of global economic crisis that engulfed the entire world economy. Though moving at different paces across the continent, political reforms are underway and have led to increased political stability. The number of unconstitutional governmental changes have reduced significantly compared to the 80s and 90s. Conflicts are gradually being resolved, and African countries, through the AU peace and security mechanism and support operations, are taking on greater responsibility for peace on the continent. African dependence on mineral income is also gradually decreasing and fueled by new developments like rapid urbanization, an educated and expanding middle class, an expanding private sector, increased access and innovative use of digital wireless technology, economic liberalization and policy reforms, easier access to credit, and greater inward investment in infrastructure and capital projects. Africa has now the youngest population and will soon have the world's largest workforce. By the end of this decade, the workforce will increase by over 160 million, and by 2050, 1 in 4 of the world's workforce will be an African. The middle class, estimated at over 300 million, is still growing. Mr. President, members of Parliament, as good as this sounds, it also highlights for us the challenges that we face in converting these potentials into developmental dividends for our people. As part of the continental leadership entrusted with the future of our continent, we need to ask ourselves, are we doing enough to ensure that the future entrusted to us becomes a reality? After 5 decades of independence, we're still politically and economically fragmented. We still operate as 54 small markets instead of one continental market. On the world stage, where, as 54 states, we constitute the largest political bloc from any continent, we are often marginalized because we are unable to unite as one integrated body. Yes, we can continue to blame it or play victim or even blame it on colonial heritage. But the question that we ask, have we done enough to change this situation? We can't change the scenario that obtains in Africa, where, for example, less than 2 and 2.5% of world trade as non-oil, non-mineral exports are even lower at an estimated of less than 1% since 1992. We can change the situation that obtains in Africa, where the highest export product concentration of any continent, we continue to rely on primary commodity exports, mainly to the European and United States of America and China, perpetuating a cycle of dependence on these external economies. We can change the level of intra-African trade, which now stands at 12%, compared to what obtains in other parts of the world, like North America 40% and about 60% in Western Europe. Yes, compared to other regions, African markets and borders are fragmented and difficult to navigate, which makes the emergence of regionally integrated industries and supply chains very difficult. The high cost of moving goods and services across continental borders leads to low competitiveness and encourages Africa to look to foreign markets instead of exporting to the huge intra-African and exploiting the intra-African potential. The absence of a viable continental accepted financial framework for international trade and the poor infrastructural connectivity in terms of air, rail, and marine and ICT, or